There exists a geography that maps do not capture. It is found in the vast spaces between seasons, in the moment before a storm breaks across an endless horizon, in the silence that precedes thunder. It is the threshold between what we know and what awaits in the darkness beyond. A frail boundary, thin as spider silk, where the mundane world and the realm of the sacred maintain their uneasy equilibrium. Here, in these liminal spaces, something ancient stirs. Something that has waited since before nations were carved from the wilderness, since before kingdoms rose and fell beneath the weight of iron and ambition. Here dwells the Zmey. Imagine, if you will, the landscape of ancient Slavic lands stretching endlessly before you. The steppes roll westward, boundless and hungry, while northern forests tower like cathedrals of wood and shadow. Rivers carve through the earth with the purpose of arteries, carrying life and danger in equal measure. These are lands where the boundary between civilization and chaos was never truly fixed. Places where a warrior might ride for days and encounter nothing but wind, then stumble upon a settlement that seemed to materialize from dreams themselves. In these geographical spaces, where humanity clung to pockets of safety amid vast wilderness, a different order of being claimed dominion. Not God, not demon, not entirely beast. Something older, something that demanded to be acknowledged, feared, and, in certain whispered tales, perhaps even respected. The Zmey of Slavic mythology occupies a unique position in the grand pantheon of dragons. It is not the hoarded, gold-obsessed tyrant of Western tradition, nor the benevolent celestial serpent of Eastern philosophy. The Zmey exists in a far more unsettling realm. That space where intelligence meets ferocity, where ancient wisdom mingles with primal hunger, where the possibility of negotiation constantly brushes against absolute annihilation. To understand the Zmey is to recognize that not all dragons are cut from the same cloth, that mythology itself is a varied tapestry reflecting the anxieties, histories, and profound observations of the cultures that wove it. The Slavic peoples, through centuries of existence, on some of the world's most contested and challenging territories, forged a dragon myth that was uniquely their own. What makes this journey particularly significant is that the Zmey tale is not merely a historical curiosity or an entertaining folklore artifact. These stories encoded the lived experiences of a people. They preserved memories of invasion and survival, encoded warnings about pride and vulnerability, and served as teaching tools for navigating a world where threats were unpredictable and often overwhelming. When a Slavic grandmother whispered a Zmey tale to a wide-eyed child huddled against the cold, she was transmitting accumulated wisdom about power, resistance, and the strange duality of nature itself. These were not abstract fantasies, but expressions of cultural memory compressed into narrative form. Throughout this exploration, we will traverse territories both geographical and psychological. We will venture into the bylinas, those ancient epic poems that form the bedrock of Russian oral tradition, where heroes such as Dobrynya Nikitich confronted the Zmey across blood-soaked battlefields and in chambers hung with impossible magic. We will examine the dragon's manifestations across the Serbian, Bulgarian, and Ukrainian traditions, discovering how a core myth transformed when filtered through different cultural lenses. We will scrutinize the symbolism of multiple heads, the significance of the numbers 3, 6, 9, and 12 that recur throughout these narratives with haunting precision. We will contemplate the kidnapped princesses and the towers where they languished, understanding what these archetypal scenarios truly represented in the minds of those who told these stories. But before we proceed further into the depths of this mythology, I want you to know that you are invited to become part of this exploration in more than a passive sense. This is the kind of journey that benefits from shared perspective and communal reflection. If you are discovering these tales for the first time, or if you are returning to them with new understanding, I encourage you to subscribe to Echoes of the Old World, a channel dedicated to preserving and illuminating the mythologies that shaped civilizations and continue to shape our collective imagination. With each new narrative we uncover, we are adding another voice to the chorus of storytellers who refuse to let these profound traditions fade into obscurity. Before we turn our attention fully to the Zmey itself, I am genuinely curious about who joins us in this moment. Take a breath and consider. From where in the world are you watching this? Are you in Eastern Europe, perhaps walking in lands where your ancestors once trembled at tales of dragons? Or do you hail from somewhere else entirely, drawn by curiosity toward mythologies distant from your own heritage? I ask because the experience of encountering these stories changes depending on where one stands, geographically, culturally, and spiritually. Your perspective, your context, matters. I invite you to share in the comments where you are viewing from and what has drawn you to explore this particular mythology. These comments create a living conversation, a testament to how ancient stories continue to resonate across time and distance. The Zmey awaits in the spaces between what we understand and what defies comprehension. It dwells in the cultural memory of millions who inherited these stories through blood and tradition. It exists in the manuscripts and stone carvings, in the heraldic symbols adorning royal insignia, in the genetic memory of a people who survived against overwhelming odds. What you are about to encounter is not merely a monster to be defeated or a curiosity to be catalogued. It is a window into how a civilization understood power, danger, resilience, and the profound truth that the world contains forces far greater than ourselves, forces that demand both courage and wisdom to navigate. The threshold stands before us now. The veil grows thin. It is time to cross into the realm of the Zmey. To understand the Zmey as it exists in the pantheon of Slavic mythology is to trace backward through centuries, across migrations and cultural transformations, to the very foundations of belief systems that predate Christianity by millennia. The dragon of Slavic tradition did not emerge fully formed in medieval chronicles, or in the bylinas recited by village storytellers around crackling fires. Rather, it evolved from a complex lineage of religious and cultural concepts that stretch deep into the Proto-Indo-European past, carrying with it echoes of beliefs held by peoples who roamed the steppes long before any nation bearing a Slavic name existed. To perceive the Zmey clearly, we must first understand the mythological substrate from which it rose. The Proto-Indo-European peoples, those ancient societies that dispersed across vast territories from the Caucasus to the Atlantic, maintained a cosmological understanding in which serpents and dragons held profound significance. These were not mere beasts, but embodiments of primordial forces, of chaos yearning against order, of the untamed wilderness pressing against human settlement, of the cosmic waters from which all creation emerged. In the Rig Veda, we encounter Vritra, the serpent of drought and chaos, slain by the storm god Indra in an act of cosmic significance. In Hittite texts, we find Iluyanka, the dragon whose defeat marked crucial mythological moments. These narratives, though expressed through different cultural lenses, share a common thread: the serpent dragon as a fundamental principle of cosmic opposition and transformation. The Zmey, when examined through this historical lens, represents a Slavic adaptation of this ancient archetype, filtered through the unique geography, history, and spiritual sensibilities of Eastern European peoples. When Slavic societies crystallized as distinct cultural entities around the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era, they inherited this ancient dragon symbolism, but transformed it according to their own lived experience. The pagan Slavic worldview prior to Christianization recognized a multiplicity of divine and semi-divine beings that populated the cosmos. The Zmey occupied a unique position within this hierarchy. It was not a god in the strict sense, nor was it entirely separate from the divine realm. Rather, it existed in that liminal space between the divine and the bestial, between the sacred and the destructive. Pre-Christian Slavic peoples, who dwelled in intimate relationship with vast forests and untamed waters, perceived the Zmey as a sovereign of those wild places, a being that embodied both the generative and destructive potential of nature itself. What becomes remarkably apparent when examining the distribution of Zmey mythology across Slavic territories is the consistency of certain core elements, despite significant geographical separation and historical divergence. In Russian tradition, the Zmey appears as Zmey Gorynych in the epic poems known as bylinas, a creature of apocalyptic power and ancient malice. In Serbian and Bulgarian folklore, analogous dragons emerge, their names and some particulars shifting, but their essential nature remaining recognizable. In Ukrainian tradition, the dragon appears as a force that shaped the very landscape, its actions leaving permanent marks upon the earth and the cultural memory of the people. This remarkable consistency across such vast territories and through centuries of separate cultural development suggests something profound: that the Zmey mythology responded to shared fundamental experiences that defined the Slavic peoples, regardless of which branch of the great Slavic family they belonged to. The persistence of the Zmey across these cultural and linguistic boundaries reveals that the dragon myth addressed something essential about the Slavic condition. Consider that Slavic peoples inhabited regions characterized by vast open spaces interspersed with impenetrable forests, by great rivers that could nurture or destroy, by climate extremes that demanded adaptation and respect. They existed on territories that would become highways of invasion, where nomadic peoples from the east periodically swept westward with overwhelming force, where survival often depended upon swift retreat to fortified positions or deep forest refuges. The Zmey, in this context, became a symbol that encoded these realities. A dragon that resided in mountains or underground caverns, that could traverse both earth and air, that possessed intelligence and agency beyond mere animal instinct. This was a metaphor for the external threats that Slavic societies faced, but also for the incomprehensible forces of nature that they must navigate. The transition from pagan to Christian belief systems in Slavic lands did not eliminate the Zmey, but rather transformed it, causing it to absorb new meanings while retaining its essential character. When Christianity arrived in Eastern Europe, it encountered a population already steeped in dragon mythology. Rather than erasing these beliefs entirely, the new religion absorbed and reinterpreted them. The Zmey became, in many Christian retellings, an agent of demonic forces, a creature that embodied heathen resistance to the new faith. Yet even in these Christianized versions, the dragon retained much of its original complexity. It was not merely a symbol of evil, but a sophisticated being worthy of narrative attention, capable of dialogue and strategic thought. This represents a remarkable cultural synthesis. The old beliefs did not vanish, but were translated into new theological frameworks. The regional variations of the Zmey mythology, while sharing core characteristics, also reveal how different Slavic peoples adapted the archetype to their specific circumstances. In territories bordering the Black Sea and characterized by steppe geography, dragons emerged that controlled weather and commanded storms, reflecting the environmental realities of these regions. In forested northern territories, the Zmey appeared as a creature of mountain caves and hidden places, reflecting the landscape itself. In river-based cultures where waterways served as essential arteries of commerce and danger, The dragon manifested with qualities related to water and its destructive potential. These variations were not mutations or corruptions of a pure original, but rather proof that the Zmey mythology remained a living tradition, adapting to reflect the particular reality of each culture that preserved it. What scholarship increasingly reveals is that the consistency of the Zmey across these boundaries arose not from some hypothetical central source that gradually dispersed, but from shared cultural inheritance combined with parallel responses to parallel circumstances. Slavic peoples, separated though they were, faced similar environmental challenges, similar threats from external populations, and maintained similar social structures and value systems. Their dragon myths, therefore, converged around common themes, not through direct transmission alone, but through the kind of mythological inevitability that emerges when distinct peoples encounter similar pressures and possess similar conceptual frameworks. The Zmey is thus both deeply ancestral, tracing its lineage backward through millennia of Proto-Indo-European tradition, and uniquely Slavic, shaped by the particular history and geography of Eastern Europe. The Zmey exists in a form that defies the familiar template of singular dragon authority, where Western dragons are typically envisioned as solitary sovereigns dwelling in isolated lairs. The Zmey frequently manifests with a multiplicity of heads, a feature that transforms it from a mere creature into something far more unsettling, a being that challenges our understanding of individual consciousness and unified will. Yet this multiplicity is not arbitrary chaos, but rather follows a pattern so consistent across Slavic traditions that it becomes clear these numbers carried profound symbolic weight in the cosmological framework of ancient and medieval Slavic peoples. To understand why the Zmey possessed exactly 3 heads, or 6, or 9, or 12, is to gain insight into how the Slavic mind perceived multiplicity, power, and the very structure of the cosmos itself. The recurrence of 3 as the defining number of Zmey heads appears across the most canonical versions of the mythology, with remarkable persistence. 3 heads dominated the legendary Zmey Gorynych, that supreme incarnation of dragon terror, whose name echoes through the bylinas with the weight of absolute authority. But why 3? To answer this question, one must recognize that 3 occupied a sacred position in Proto-Indo-European and Slavic cosmological thinking long before the Zmey emerged as a mythological figure. 3 represented completion, cycle, and fundamental structure. The 3 realms, sky, earth, and underworld, divided the cosmos into comprehensible domains. The 3 estates of medieval society, clergy, nobility, and commons, reflected an understanding that 3 was the minimum number required to establish meaningful social order. In religious practice, the number 3 appeared constantly: 3 days of ritual, 3-fold blessing, 3 cycles of seasonal transformation. The 3-headed Zmey, therefore, was not merely a beast with multiple attack capabilities, but a dragon that embodied a complete cosmic principle. When we move beyond 3 to the 6-headed variants of the Zmey, we encounter a different expression of cosmic order. 6 represents doubling, the multiplication of the sacred triad into a more complex manifestation. In Slavic numerical symbolism, 6 often appeared in contexts suggesting intensified power or expanded dominion. 6-headed dragons, in certain traditions, occupied territories of greater scale or possessed authority over multiple kingdoms simultaneously. The progression from 3 to 6 suggests not merely more heads, but a qualitative transformation, the dragon moving from singular cosmic force to plural dominating entity. Some scholars have noted that 6-headed dragons more frequently appear in narratives describing conflicts of massive scale or invasions affecting entire regions, as if the additional heads reflected the expanded scope of devastation and territory under the dragon's influence. This was a dragon not content with a single kingdom, but driven to dominate across multiple lands simultaneously. The nine-headed Zmey occupies a unique position in the hierarchy of dragon manifestations, representing what might be described as an apex of complexity within traditional mythology. 9 carries particular resonance in Slavic tradition, appearing frequently in ritual contexts, in folk songs with specific stanzaic structures, and in narratives emphasizing ultimate power or complete magical knowledge. A 9-headed dragon was often portrayed as ancient beyond measure, having survived multiple ages and accumulated wisdom alongside its hunger. The 9 heads sometimes represented 9 different domains or knowledge systems, 1 head for each realm of magic, each form of knowledge, each possible future that the dragon could perceive and manipulate. In certain narratives, the 9-headed Zmey appeared almost as a conscious embodiment of multiple aspects of fate itself, a creature that had transcended simple bestial existence and entered into something approaching mystical omniscience, however malevolent that omniscience might be. 12-headed dragons represent the ultimate manifestation of Zmey power, carrying the sacred number 12 that appears throughout world mythology as a marker of cosmic completeness and total authority. 12 zodiacal signs, 12 months completing the year cycle, 12 realms or kingdoms. The appearance of 12 heads on a Zmey suggested a creature that had claimed dominion over all possible domains, that embodied not merely regional or even continental authority, but something approaching universal sovereignty. Dragons with 12 heads were exceedingly rare in recorded narratives, reserved for apocalyptic scenarios or for the most ancient and powerful entities that inhabited the mythological substrate prior to the emergence of human civilization. When a 12-headed Zmey appeared in a tale, the narrative often carried implications of ultimate confrontation, of battles that would determine not merely the fate of kingdoms, but the very structure of reality itself. What becomes apparent when examining these numerical patterns is that they were not decorative but functional. They carried precise meanings within the cosmological and spiritual framework of Slavic peoples. Each head of the Zmey represented more than mere biological repetition. Medieval and folklore scholars increasingly recognized that these heads often functioned as distinct consciousness components, each capable of independent thought, yet coordinated toward common purpose. A 3-headed dragon could, in effect, perceive 3 different threats simultaneously, could speak 3 different languages, could weave 3 independent magical incantations in concert. A 6-headed dragon possessed the capacity to manage 6 simultaneous negotiations or threats, making it a creature of frightening diplomatic and strategic complexity. This was not a dim-witted monster with redundant appendages, but a being whose very physiology expressed its intellectual and magical sophistication. The significance of these numbers becomes even more apparent when we consider that in Slavic tradition they appear almost as mathematical expressions of power itself. 3 heads provided a dragon with fundamental cosmic authority. 6 heads multiplied that authority and suggested territorial expansion. 9 heads indicated mystical knowledge and ancient wisdom accumulated across centuries. 12 heads represented absolute dominion and universal threat. This was a graduated scale of danger, a numerical hierarchy that allowed audiences of these tales to immediately grasp the relative threat level posed by any given dragon. A warrior confronting a 3-headed Zmey faced a challenge of considerable magnitude. A hero against a 6-headed dragon confronted odds that suggested near impossibility. A 9-headed Zmey represented not merely a challenge, but a metaphysical adversary. A 12-headed dragon was effectively unkillable through conventional means. Only cosmic intervention or extraordinary heroic achievement could overcome such a force. The consistency of these numerical patterns across different regions and time periods of Slavic mythology suggests deep cultural programming, values embedded so thoroughly in the collective consciousness that they persisted unchanged through migration, religious conversion, and centuries of political transformation. Whether in Russian bylinas, Serbian epic poetry, Bulgarian folklore traditions, or Ukrainian narratives, these numbers appeared with ritualistic consistency, suggesting that they fulfilled a fundamental cultural function. They provided a common language through which communities could discuss and comprehend forces of overwhelming magnitude and complexity. When a storyteller described a dragon possessing 3 heads, every listener within that cultural framework immediately understood the cosmological implications. The Zmey's anatomy was not arbitrary, but rather a reflection of how the Slavic peoples mathematically and spiritually understood the organization of power itself. Among all the manifestations of the Zmey across Slavic mythology, one name rises above all others with the weight of absolute authority and primal terror. Zmey Gorynych, the mountain dragon, the sovereign of the 3-headed dynasty, stands as the most legendary, most feared, and most thoroughly documented incarnation of dragon malevolence in Russian and broader Slavic tradition. To speak of Zmey Gorynych is to speak of the archetype itself, the dragon against which all others are measured, the being whose deeds were preserved in the bylinas with such vivid detail that centuries later we can still perceive the fear that trembled through the voices of those who first recounted these tales around ancient fires. Zmey Gorynych is not merely a dragon. Zmey Gorynych is the dragon, the sovereign embodiment of everything that the word dragon was meant to convey in the Slavic consciousness. The etymology of the name itself carries profound significance and reveals much about how ancient peoples understood this creature's essential nature. Gorynych derives from the Russian word gora, meaning mountain or height, suggesting immediately that this dragon was intimately associated with elevated places, with peaks that touched the realm of the divine, with positions of towering dominance from which it could survey vast territories beneath its gaze. Some interpretations suggest the name carries connotations of fire and burning, implying that the dragon itself was virtually synonymous with conflagration and devastation. Others emphasize the root, suggesting something ancient and primordial, a creature that had existed since before recorded time began. The name itself, therefore, functioned as a complete description. It told the listener that here was a being of mountainous power, associated with flames and destruction, ancient beyond measure, and positioned at heights of absolute authority. The physical appearance of Zmey Gorynych, as described across the bylinas and later folklore accounts, presents a creature of overwhelming and incomprehensible scale. 3 heads of massive proportions emerge from a body described as being larger than the mightiest fortifications of human kingdoms. A dragon whose wingspan could obscure the sun and whose weight could shake the earth with each movement. Each head possessed eyes described as burning coals, orbs of such malevolent intelligence that to meet their gaze was to feel one's courage drain like water from a broken vessel. The scales covering Zmey Gorynich's body were said to be of such extraordinary hardness that ordinary weapons could not pierce them, requiring instead enchanted blades, or the strength of heroes blessed by divine favor. The creature's maw revealed teeth like swords, and its claws could tear through stone as easily as human hands might tear through parchment, suggesting a creature whose physical capabilities transcended anything that mere biology would seem to permit. But the true terror of Zmey Gorynych emerged not merely from its physical magnitude, but from its active malevolence. This was a dragon that did not slumber in a distant cavern, indifferent to human suffering. Rather, it was driven by an apparent hunger for destruction and domination that manifested in deliberate campaigns of terror. Zmey Gorynych did not content itself with hoarding treasure or maintaining a solitary lair. Instead, it ranged across the lands, burning settlements seemingly for the purpose of demonstrating its power, capturing entire kingdoms through terror alone, and demanding tributes that impoverished entire regions. The dragons seemed to possess not merely animal appetites, but genuine malice, a desire to inflict suffering that suggested something approaching purposeful cruelty rather than simple predatory hunger. Chronicles and tales consistently describe Zmey Gorynych as intelligent enough to negotiate, to make demands, to demonstrate knowledge of human psychology and weakness. The lair of Zmey Gorynych, as tradition describes it, was situated in the mountains at a height where ordinary humans could not reach without extraordinary effort. Some accounts place it in the Caucasus region, positioning the dragon as a sovereign of the southernmost boundaries of Slavic territory. Other versions situate it in more northern mountain ranges, each localization reflecting the particular geographic anxieties of the cultures that preserve these tales. The mountain fortress, or cavern, where Zmey Gorynych dwelt, was described as vast beyond comprehension, its interior decorated with the accumulated treasures of conquered kingdoms, adorned with the wealth of centuries of extortion and plunder. Yet this was not merely a hoard, but a display of dominion, a collection that served to demonstrate the dragon's power over all material wealth and human achievement. Within this mountain citadel, Zmey Gorynych maintained its reign of terror, conducting operations of domination that extended across enormous territories. The reign of Zmey Gorynych, as preserved in the bylinas and related accounts, appears to have been characterized by relentless expansion and increasingly audacious demands. The dragon systematically conquered regions, extracting tributes of gold, livestock, and eventually human captives. Princesses were a particular obsession of this three-headed sovereign, and the capture of noble maidens from across various kingdoms became a hallmark of Zmey Gorynich's campaigns. These kidnappings were not random acts of predation, but seemed calculated to maximize terror among human populations and to consolidate the dragon's domination through the seizure of symbols of royal power and legitimacy. The mere rumor that Zmey Gorynich's emissaries approached a kingdom could cause panic among the populace and desperation among the nobility, for resistance appeared futile against a being of such overwhelming power. What distinguishes Zmey Gorynych from mere natural disaster or mindless force is the consistent portrayal of the dragon as capable of negotiation and strategic thinking. The bylinas describe encounters where Zmey Gorynych speaks, where it comprehends human language and responds, with responses that demonstrate comprehension and calculation rather than instinctive reaction. The dragon could be bargained with, after a fashion. Agreements could be made, tributes negotiated, and truces established, albeit always on terms overwhelmingly favorable to the dragon itself. This capacity for speech and reasoning elevated Zmey Gorynych beyond the status of mere monster and into something more akin to a sovereign power, a being deserving of recognition as an intelligent entity despite its absolute malevolence. It was this combination, overwhelming physical power united with genuine intelligence and strategic capability, that made Zmey Gorynych such a formidable and terrifying figure in the imagination of those who preserved and transmitted these tales. The presence of Zmey Gorynych in the bylinas was not constant or unchanging, but rather cyclical, with periods of dormancy alternating with renewed campaigns of terror. This pattern suggested that even a dragon of such magnitude could be temporarily constrained or diminished, offering a glimmer of hope to those who suffered under its dominion. Yet, each time Zmey Gorynych returned, it appeared to emerge with renewed hunger and determination, suggesting that no mere temporary victory could eliminate the threat permanently. The dragon was described as regenerating from wounds that should have been fatal, recovering from apparent defeats with mystical rapidity, and returning from periods of absence stronger and more terrible than before. Zmey Gorynych represented, in essence, an inexhaustible force of destruction, a being that embodied the principle of renewal through violence and the eternal return of chaos to challenge human civilization. Deep within the mythology of the Zmey lies a pattern so recurrent, so obsessively preserved through centuries of transmission, that it cannot be dismissed as mere narrative convenience. The kidnapping of princesses stands as one of the defining motifs of Zmey legend, appearing across Russian bylinas, Serbian epics, Bulgarian folklore traditions, and Ukrainian narratives with such consistency that its very repetition demands interpretation. This was not a random predatory act, not the arbitrary cruelty of a monster consuming whatever prey crossed its path. Rather, it was a calculated strategy, a deliberate targeting of women of royal blood that served purposes both practical and deeply symbolic. To understand why the Zmey consistently sought out princesses is to glimpse the true meanings embedded within these ancient stories, meanings that operated on multiple levels simultaneously: political, psychological, and profoundly cultural. Consider first the practical dimensions of princess abduction as a strategy of domination. A princess was not merely a woman, but a symbol of dynastic continuity and royal authority. She was the potential bearer of heirs, the embodiment of her father's bloodline, and often the site of important political alliances through marriage arrangements. When Zmey Gorynych captured a princess, it did not merely remove a single individual from human society. It severed a critical link in the chain of succession and inheritance that held kingdoms together. The princess abducted by the dragon became a prisoner who could bear no heirs for any mortal kingdom, whose political value evaporated the moment the dragon's claws grasped her. In this sense, the kidnappings were acts of strategic warfare against human civilization itself, deliberate efforts to disrupt the very mechanisms through which human societies maintained continuity and order. But the significance of the kidnapping motif extended far beyond mere strategic calculation. The tower in which princesses were imprisoned, and these towers appear consistently in the narratives, often described as rising impossibly high, isolated from human habitation, surrounded by landscapes of desolation, became a symbol of absolute separation from the human world. These were not dungeons of stone and iron where escape might be possible through human effort. Rather, they were magical prisons, towers that existed in a liminal space between the material and spiritual worlds, locations that transcended normal geography. A princess imprisoned in a Zmey tower was not merely detained, but effectively removed from the realm of human reality altogether. She occupied a space that was simultaneously present and absent, a captive who existed in the dragon's world rather than the world of her birth. The tower itself became a threshold between worlds, and the princess within it, a hostage to forces that transcended human comprehension or human power. The condition of captivity, as experienced by these stolen princesses, represented something far more sinister than mere physical imprisonment. The narratives consistently describe these women as existing in a state of profound isolation, separated from their fathers and mothers, from their siblings and the courts that knew them, from the very society that defined their identity. Some accounts describe how the Zmey would demand that princesses tend to its needs, prepare food, maintain the dragon's lair, tasks that forced them into an obscene domestic relationship with the creature that imprisoned them. Other versions describe psychological torment, conversations in which the dragon sought to convince the princesses of the futility of rescue, that no mortal hero could overcome such a being, that they should abandon hope and accept their new existence. The isolation was not accidental, but deliberate, a calculated destruction of the princess's connection to her human identity and community. This psychological dimension of the captivity suggests that the kidnapping served purposes beyond mere political calculation. What becomes apparent when examining these narratives across multiple cultural traditions is that the princess motif encoded something profound about the relationship between human civilization and the forces that threatened it. The princess, in medieval and pre-medieval societies, represented both the purity of the human realm and its vulnerability. She was typically young, beautiful, and unmarried, characteristics that made her simultaneously a symbol of potential future and a being without the warrior status that might enable physical resistance. Her abduction represented the violation and subjugation of everything she symbolized: beauty, innocence, continuity, hope, and the future itself. When the Zmey stole princesses, it was in a very real sense stealing the future from human kingdoms, removing from circulation the women who would bear the next generation and continue the dynasty. The tower became the physical manifestation of the theft, a location where futures were suspended indefinitely. The positioning of these towers in the narratives deserves particular attention, for their locations were rarely chosen arbitrarily. Many accounts describe towers situated at the boundary between the human world and the Zmey's domain, at the edge of the highest mountains, at the deepest point in a wild forest, at an island accessible only by crossing waters known for their danger and unpredictability. These boundary positions were crucial to the narrative function of the tower, for they placed the captive princess in a liminal state where she was neither fully in the human world nor fully in the Zmey's realm. The tower at the boundary became a kind of mirror or reflection point, a location from which the princess could observe both worlds, but be fully contained by neither. Some versions describe how the princesses would appear at windows of these towers during certain times of day or night, visible to those in the human world but unreachable, their presence both confirming that they lived and emphasizing the absolute impossibility of rescue through conventional means. The rescue of kidnapped princesses formed the central motivation for heroic action in numerous bylinas and folklore narratives, and this narrative structure itself reveals the cultural function of the princess motif. A princess imprisoned by the Zmey represented a challenge that could not be met through ordinary warfare or diplomacy. No army could assault a dragon's tower. No negotiation could convince a being of such malevolence to release its prize through simple bargaining. Rather, rescue required a hero, a figure of exceptional capability who possessed not merely physical strength, but also courage, cunning, magical knowledge, or divine favor. The princess became the object around which heroic narratives pivoted, the justification for quests and trials that would define the hero and test his worthiness. In this framework, the kidnapped princess was not merely a victim requiring rescue, but the central symbolic element that made heroic action possible and necessary. The emotional resonance of the princess motif cannot be overlooked, for these tales were not abstract philosophical exercises, but stories that generated profound emotional responses in their audiences. Parents, listening to accounts of princesses stolen by dragons, were hearing narratives that spoke directly to fundamental human fears. The terror of separation from children, the helplessness of watching those we love slip beyond our ability to protect them. The anguish of understanding that some forces exist beyond human capacity to resist. The stories encoded these emotional truths while simultaneously transforming them through the framework of mythology. What began as raw fear of loss and separation was refined and elevated into narrative form, creating a container through which communities could acknowledge and contemplate their deepest vulnerabilities. In the vast tapestry of Slavic heroic tradition, certain names rise above all others, with the weight of historical memory and legendary achievement. Dobrynya Nikitich stands foremost among these figures, a hero whose confrontations with the Zmey form the central narrative axis of Russian bylinas and Eastern European folklore. Where Zmey Gorynych represented the principle of overwhelming destructive force, Dobrynya embodied the counterbalance, the hero who possessed not merely physical prowess, but the cunning, courage, and connection to the divine that permitted him to challenge and overcome beings that seemed fundamentally unkillable. His struggle against the Zmey was not a simple clash of strength against strength, but rather an epic confrontation between different orders of being, between human determination and primordial dragon terror, between the civilization that Dobrynya defended and the chaotic destruction that the Zmey represented. Dobrynya Nikitich emerges in the bylinas as a figure of remarkable lineage and exceptional capabilities. Born of noble blood, descended from families whose names carried weight in the courts of Russian princes, Dobrynya was trained from youth in the warrior arts and educated in knowledge that transcended mere military technique. The bylinas describe his upbringing with particular emphasis on his mother's teachings. Maternal wisdom that instilled in him values of justice, courage tempered with wisdom, and an understanding that not all conflicts could be resolved through strength alone. This combination of martial training, noble birth, and maternal guidance created a hero who possessed dimensions beyond the typical warrior template. Dobrynya was capable of negotiation and deception as well as combat, of recognizing when to fight and when to employ strategy, of understanding that his opponent, however terrible, was an intelligent being worthy of consideration and calculated response. The various bylinas describing Dobrynya's encounter with the Zmey present differing accounts of the specific circumstances and details of their confrontation, yet a core narrative structure emerges consistently across these tellings. Dobrynya ventures forth, either as a voluntary quest or as a response to the Zmey's specific threat to his people, traveling toward the mountain or cave where the dragon maintains its lair. The journey itself carries significance, for Dobrynya must traverse terrain that grows increasingly hostile and unnatural as he approaches the threshold of the Zmey's domain. The landscape itself seems to conspire against the hero. Paths become obscured, the sky darkens with unnatural weather, and the very air grows thick with a palpable sense of dread. Yet Dobrynya persists, driven by determination and fortified by the knowledge that his people depend upon his success, that the capture of their princesses and the extortion of their treasures cannot continue unchallenged. When Dobrynya finally encounters the Zmey, the meeting is often described as occurring in a place of terrible beauty, a desolate river valley, a mountain pass surrounded by spectral mists, or a plain where the earth itself seems scorched and lifeless from the dragon's previous passage. The confrontation does not begin immediately with violence, but frequently with dialogue, with the Zmey recognizing in Dobrynya a worthy opponent and seeking to understand the nature of this human's presumption. These conversations between hero and dragon reveal the intelligence and dignity of both parties. The Zmey is not a mindless beast, but a being capable of appreciating courage and capable of comprehending the motivations that drive its adversary. Yet beneath this surface courtesy lies absolute incompatibility. The Zmey and Dobrynya represent forces that cannot coexist, principles that are fundamentally at odds with one another. The dragon must either vanquish the hero and eliminate the threat to its dominion, or it must accept diminishment of its power and authority. The actual combat, when it erupts, is described in the bylinas with vivid and dramatic language that conveys the overwhelming difficulty of the task Dobrynya has undertaken. The Zmey possesses advantages of staggering magnitude, physical size that renders the hero minuscule by comparison, scales that resist ordinary weapons, magical capabilities that transcend human understanding, and raw destructive power that seems to bend reality itself. When the dragon moves, the earth trembles. When it breathes, flames or poisonous mist engulfs the landscape. When it strikes, its claws can tear through stone and steel as though they were parchment. By any rational assessment, Dobrynya should be instantly overwhelmed, crushed beneath the Zmey's assault, incinerated by its flames, or suffocated by the very presence of such concentrated malevolence. Yet the hero persists, employing tactics that suggest both divine favor and extraordinary personal qualities. The bylinas describe Dobrynya employing various weapons and strategies in his battles against the Zmey. Some versions mention an enchanted sword, a blade forged with magical properties specifically designed to pierce dragon scales, suggesting that divine forces had prepared tools for this confrontation. Other accounts emphasize Dobrynya's skill and cunning, describing how he learns the dragon's patterns of attack, identifies moments of vulnerability, and exploits gaps in its defenses through intelligence and experience rather than mere strength. Certain versions introduce magical elements, Dobrynya invoking divine protection, calling upon forces that constrain the Zmey's powers, or discovering that certain words or symbols carry power against the dragon. What emerges across these varying accounts is a consistent portrait of a hero who succeeds not through simple, overwhelming force, but through a combination of courage, intelligence, magical knowledge, and seemingly divine favor. The outcomes described in various bylinas differ significantly, reflecting how the stories evolved and adapted across regions and centuries. In some versions, Dobrynya slays the Zmey entirely, delivering a death blow that ends the dragon's reign of terror permanently. In others, he defeats the creature sufficiently to force it into retreat, driving the Zmey away from human lands, or into a magical imprisonment from which it cannot escape. Certain accounts describe how Dobrynya wounds the Zmey mortally, but at great cost to himself, requiring rescue or divine intervention to preserve his own life. The most complex versions present Dobrynya negotiating with the Zmey, establishing terms under which the dragon withdraws its attacks and releases captive princesses in exchange for recognition and tribute. These varying endings suggest that the story served multiple narrative purposes, sometimes emphasizing absolute victory, sometimes acknowledging the incomplete nature of human triumph over such ancient and powerful forces. Regardless of the specific outcome preserved in any particular byline, what remains consistent is the profound significance of Dobrynya's actions for human civilization. His confrontation with the Zmey represented humanity's refusal to accept victimhood, the determination of mortals to resist forces that seemed overwhelming and unkillable. Dobrynya became the template for the hero, the figure who possessed not merely strength, but wisdom, not merely courage, but strategic capability, not merely personal power, but connection to forces and knowledge that transcended ordinary human existence. His struggle against the Zmey was preserved and retold because it spoke to fundamental human needs. The need to believe that courage could matter even when odds seemed impossible. That intelligence and determination could overcome raw power. That communities possessed within themselves the capacity to resist and survive threats of overwhelming magnitude. While Zmey Gorynych stands as the most celebrated and most thoroughly documented incarnation of Slavic dragon mythology, To focus exclusively upon this singular manifestation would be to profoundly diminish our understanding of how deeply the dragon myth permeated Slavic consciousness. Across the vast territories inhabited by Slavic peoples, from the frozen northern forests to the southern borderlands, from eastern steppes to the western reaches of Eastern Europe, variations of the Zmey emerged that reflected local geography, regional history, and the particular fears and spiritual frameworks of distinct communities. These variant dragons were not corruptions or diminutions of some hypothetical pure archetype, but rather expressions of the fundamental dragon principle adapted to specific cultural contexts. Each regional manifestation carried its own name, its own symbolic significance, and its own particular methods of terrorizing and engaging with human civilization. To overlook these variants is to miss crucial dimensions of how mythology functioned as a living, evolving tradition rather than a static corpus of unchanging tales. In Serbian and Bulgarian traditions, dragons emerged bearing names and characteristics that reflected the unique geographical and historical circumstances of the South Slavic peoples. Zmaj, as the dragon was known in Serbian tradition, often manifested with characteristics distinctly suited to the Mediterranean climate and the specific vulnerabilities of South Slavic communities. Where northern Zmey Gorynych commanded winter storms and mountain peaks, the Serbian Zmaj frequently appeared as a being intimately connected to water, to the Danube and its tributaries, to seasonal flooding, to the unpredictable rivers that both sustained and devastated South Slavic settlements. Some Serbian dragons possessed only 6 heads rather than the canonical 3, suggesting a different calibration of cosmic force, reflecting the particular scale of threats faced by Serbian communities. Bulgarian variants, similarly, adapted the core dragon mythology to reflect their own relationship with landscape and history, creating dragons that embodied the specific environmental hazards and external pressures that characterize Bulgarian territorial experience. Ukrainian dragon traditions, preserved in folk narratives and songs that survived centuries of suppression and foreign domination, demonstrate a fascinating variation on the Zmey archetype that emphasizes different dimensions of dragon power and significance. The Ukrainian Zmey, as documented in folk traditions and later literary adaptations, sometimes appeared as beings less interested in territorial conquest and more focused on supernatural seduction or magical manipulation. Some Ukrainian accounts describe dragons that had taken humanoid form, beings capable of disguising their true nature and moving among human populations, creating confusion and chaos through deception rather than direct destructive force. Other versions emphasize the dragon's role as guardian of sacred places or keeper of ancient secrets, suggesting a more ambiguous moral status than the unambiguously malevolent Zmey Gorynych. These variations reflect the particular historical experience of Ukrainian peoples, whose territories were contested by multiple empires and whose folklore increasingly emphasized survival through cunning and magical knowledge rather than direct confrontation. The proliferation of 6-headed dragons across various Slavic traditions warrants particular attention, for these creatures occupied a specific position within the hierarchy of dragon manifestations. Where 3-headed dragons represented fundamental cosmic opposition and 9-headed dragons embodied mystical complexity, the 6-headed variants seem to express a calibrated level of threat, appropriate to communities facing significant but not apocalyptic challenges. Some scholarly interpretations suggest that 6-headed dragons appeared more frequently in narratives describing regional conflicts rather than civilization-threatening invasions, suggesting that the number of heads correlated directly with the scale and scope of the threat being represented. Tales of 6-headed dragons were often preserved by communities that had survived dragon encounters or maintained ongoing complex relationships with dragon figures. unlike the more absolute narratives of complete subjugation characteristic of Zmey Gorynych accounts. Four-headed dragons appear occasionally in certain regional traditions, representing an unusual variation that challenges the pattern of multiples of three. These rarer variants suggest experimentation within the broader mythological framework, instances where specific communities adapted the dragon archetype to express particular cosmological or historical concepts. The appearance of four-headed dragons in certain Serbian and Slovak traditions may reflect syncretism with other mythological systems, or represent local innovations that never achieved the cultural penetration of the three-head archetype. These variant forms remind us that mythology was not entirely rigid, but rather possessed flexibility, allowing for regional innovation and creative adaptation, while maintaining core structural elements that resonated across the broader Slavic cultural sphere. The two-headed dragon, appearing primarily in heraldic traditions rather than in folklore narratives, represents yet another manifestation of the core Zmey principle, adapted for different cultural purposes. In heraldic contexts, the two-headed dragon often symbolized dual authority or the union of separate powers, appearing on royal emblems and fortification symbols to represent sovereignty and territorial dominion. While these heraldic dragons lacked the narrative complexity and supernatural terror of their folklore counterparts, they served crucial functions in the visual semiotics of power and authority. The transition from terrifying mythological being to heraldic symbol represents a process of cultural domestication, a transformation through which the raw power of the dragon was channeled into systems of political representation and dynastic authority. Specialized dragon variants emerged in response to particular historical events or regional circumstances. Border dragons, for instance, appeared in narratives describing conflicts along the peripheries of Slavic territories, beings that seemed to embody the chaotic and dangerous nature of frontier zones. River dragons inhabited accounts from communities dependent upon waterways for survival, creatures whose dominion extended over aquatic domains and whose presence explained the dangers that lurked beneath waters. Mountain dragons, obviously, concentrated their power in elevated terrain, reflecting how different geographical features generated distinct versions of the underlying dragon myth. These specialized manifestations demonstrate how flexibly the core Zmey concept could be adapted. The fundamental principle of the dragon, as embodiment of overwhelming external threat, could be projected onto any dangerous environmental or political reality that a community needed to comprehend and explain. The progressive Christianization of Slavic territories introduced further variations into dragon mythology, as the pagan Zmey was incorporated into Christian cosmological frameworks. The dragon became, in many Christian-influenced accounts, an agent of demonic forces, a manifestation of Satan's power, or a creature deployed by dark forces in their eternal struggle against Christian civilization. Yet, even within this Christianized framework, the dragon retained much of its original complexity and intelligence. Christian dragons in Slavic tradition often negotiated with human figures, demonstrated strategic reasoning, and occasionally allied with human characters against other threats. These Christianized dragons represented a fascinating synthesis, combining elements of Christian demonology with the sophisticated supernatural being that pagan Slavic tradition had preserved. What separates the Zmey from the mere monster, what elevates it beyond the status of a simple predatory beast, is a characteristic that defies the expectations we hold for creatures of such immense physical power. The Zmey speaks, not through instinct or simple animal vocalizations, but through deliberate articulation of language, through the formation of complex thoughts expressed in human speech. This capacity for language represents a fundamental threshold that transforms the dragon from threat into something far more unsettling, an intelligent entity capable of reasoning, negotiation, and the expression of ideas that transcend mere predatory hunger. To encounter a Zmey was not merely to face danger, but to confront a being of alien intelligence, a consciousness fundamentally opposed to human existence, yet capable of comprehending and engaging with human thought. This strange bridge between minds, the possibility of communication with a being that remained absolutely inimical, created a psychological dimension to Zmey encounters that manifested in the narratives with persistent and haunting force. The accounts preserved in the bylinas and folklore traditions are remarkably consistent in their descriptions of Zmey speech patterns and communicative behavior. The dragon does not speak like humans, using the voices of ordinary mortals. Rather, its voice is described in language suggesting something that transcends normal auditory experience. A sound like thunder, like the grinding of mountains, like the howling of winds across desolate places, rendered somehow comprehensible, yet never entirely natural or comfortable. When the Zmey speaks, listeners are said to experience the words not merely through hearing, but through a kind of direct mental comprehension, as though the dragon's thoughts were being imposed directly upon consciousness, rather than transmitted through conventional linguistic channels. Some accounts describe how the Zmey's speech carried a quality of absolute authority, as though the very utterance of words by such a creature invested them with power and inevitability. To be addressed by the Zmey was to experience something approaching violation, an intrusion of alien consciousness into the sanctum of one's own mind. The content of Zmey's speech, as preserved in the narratives, reveals a being capable of sophisticated reasoning, strategic calculation, and genuine understanding of human psychology. The dragon did not merely roar threats or demand tribute through crude gestures. Rather, it engaged in actual negotiations, proposing specific terms and understanding the precise value of what it demanded. In various bylinas, the Zmey is described negotiating with princes and warriors, expressing its conditions with clarity and acknowledging the terms of any agreements made. These conversations suggest a being that comprehended not merely power, but law, not merely dominion, but the frameworks through which power could be legitimately expressed and recognized. When the Zmey spoke of tribute, it was not making inarticulate demands, but rather proposing what it understood to be a reasonable exchange, treasure and captives, in return for tolerating the continued existence of human settlements within its claimed territories. This capacity for negotiation, however self-serving and exploitative, reveals that the Zmey operated according to principles of logic and recognized, to some degree, the legitimacy of human civilization even as it sought to dominate and exploit it. The intelligence of the Zmey manifested not merely in verbal expression, but in demonstrated strategic capability and tactical comprehension. The bylinas describe how the dragon anticipated human responses to its actions, how it positioned itself to maximize advantage, and how it employed its forces, whether subordinate creatures or human captives, according to carefully considered plans rather than random aggression. Zmey Gorynych, in particular, is portrayed as engaging in long-term strategic domination, expanding its territorial control through deliberate stages, extracting ever-increasing tributes as its power consolidated, and employing the fear it generated as an active weapon in its subjugation of human kingdoms. This was not a being acting from mere appetite or instinct, but rather from calculation, from an understanding that territory could be expanded, that resources could be accumulated, that power could be systematized and maintained through the orchestration of human fear and compliance. The dragon was, in essence, engaging in governance, the maintenance of a terrible order across vast territories through the projection of power and the threat of overwhelming force. Beyond mere intelligence and strategic capability, the Zmey possessed knowledge of magic, sorcery, that transcended human understanding and operated according to principles that human scholars and priests struggled to comprehend. The narratives consistently describe how the Zmey wielded powers that were not merely expressions of physical capability, but rather manifestations of magical knowledge accumulated across centuries or even millennia of existence. The dragon could alter weather, could command storms, could manipulate the very landscape itself. Some accounts describe how the Zmey possessed knowledge of languages lost to human memory, comprehension of rituals and symbols whose meanings had been forgotten by mortals. The dragon was depicted as capable of binding other creatures to its will through magical compulsion, of casting enchantments that would render warriors helpless, of perceiving events occurring at great distances through arcane knowledge. This magical dimension of Zmey power represented something fundamentally different from mere physical strength. It suggested that the dragon operated in spiritual and mystical realms that humans could barely perceive. The sources of Zmey magical knowledge remain obscure in the narratives, suggesting layers of ancient understanding that predated any human civilization and might extend beyond the material world itself. Some traditions propose that the Zmey inherited magical capability from divine or primordial sources, that the dragon's power derived from connection to ancient cosmic principles that had shaped reality itself. Other accounts suggest that the Zmey had accumulated magical knowledge through centuries of existence, studying and learning from every human sorcerer or spirit being it encountered. The dragon was depicted in these frameworks not as a being simply born into its power, but rather as a consciousness capable of learning, of accumulating knowledge, of becoming progressively more formidable through the acquisition of magical understanding. This made the Zmey potentially more dangerous over time, a being whose power could theoretically increase without limit as it learned and accumulated knowledge across the centuries of its existence. The combination of intelligence, strategic capability, and magical power created a threat that transcended simple military challenge. A kingdom could raise armies against a Zmey and find those armies rendered helpless through magical means. A kingdom could fortify its cities and discover that the dragon possessed the sorcerous knowledge to circumvent those defenses. A kingdom could attempt negotiation, only to find that the Zmey, however capable of understanding human language and motivation, remained fundamentally committed to exploitation and domination. This was an adversary that operated on multiple levels simultaneously: physical, intellectual, magical, and psychological. To face the Zmey required not merely warriors but also magic users, not merely courage but also cunning, not merely physical preparation but also spiritual fortitude. The dragon could not be defeated through any single approach, but only through the integration of multiple forms of human capability and knowledge, through the united effort of those who brought together strength, wisdom, and magical understanding in coordinated action. When we contemplate the arsenal of destruction wielded by the Zmey, when we attempt to comprehend the full scope of the creature's capability for devastation, we must confront two elemental forces that appear consistently across the narratives: fire and storm. Yet to understand these powers merely as manifestations of destructive capability is to fundamentally misunderstand what they represented in the consciousness of the Slavic peoples. Fire and storm were not random forces, but rather expressions of cosmic principle, embodiments of the untamed and unkillable energies that lurked at the boundaries of human civilization. The Zmey's command of these forces transformed the dragon from a mere physical threat into something approaching a cosmic principle, a being that could manipulate fundamental elements of existence itself. To face a Zmey was thus to face not only teeth and claws, but also the elements themselves, made conscious and directed toward destruction by the will of an intelligent and malevolent being. the fire-breathing capacity of the Zmey, as described in the bylinas and folklore accounts, differed subtly but significantly from the fire-breathing dragons of Western European tradition. Where Western dragons expelled flames as a simple bodily function, like a predatory mechanism evolved across generations, the Zmey's fire appeared to operate according to more deliberate magical principles. The narratives describe how the dragon could modulate its flames, producing intense infernos that would incinerate entire settlements, or more controlled flames directed at specific targets. Some accounts suggest that the Zmey could breathe flames that possessed qualities transcending normal fire, flames that could not be extinguished through conventional means, that would burn indefinitely once kindled, that possessed a dark character, reflecting the malevolent will directing them. The very nature of Zmey fire seemed transformed by its passage through the dragon's being, corrupted into something more terrible than ordinary flame. When the Zmey unleashed its fire, it was not merely applying heat, but rather introducing a kind of fundamental wrongness into the material world, flames that carried the stamp of dragon malice. The scope of destruction wrought by Zmey fire, as preserved in the narratives, suggests forces of apocalyptic scale. Chronicles and bylinas describe how the dragon's flames could consume entire cities, could reduce fortified strongholds to ash and rubble, could strip the landscape of vegetation and life across vast territories. The psychological impact of such devastation would have been immense. The knowledge that a single being possessed the capacity to obliterate everything that a community had built, to reduce generations of construction and culture to cinders, would generate terror fundamentally different from the fear of conventional warfare. When kingdoms faced each other, defeat meant displacement and subjugation. When facing the Zmey's flames, defeat meant annihilation. The very existence of cities and settlements remained contingent upon the dragon's tolerance, conditional upon the payment of tributes and the fulfillment of demands. This transformation of security into perpetual vulnerability would have shaped the psychological relationship between communities and the dragon. Yet the power of fire, as terrible as it was, represented only one dimension of Zmey's destructive capability. The storm, that manifestation of elemental fury combining wind, water, and atmospheric disturbance, represented an equally significant and perhaps more fundamentally terrifying expression of dragon power. Where fire was localized and directional, storm encompassed entire regions. Where fire required proximity, storm could be generated from vast distances. The Zmey's command of weather transformed the dragon into a being that could strike at the very foundations of agricultural societies, dependent upon predictable seasons and manageable rainfall. When the Zmey called forth storms, according to the narratives, it was not merely creating weather, but rather manifesting malevolent consciousness through atmospheric phenomena. The descriptions speak of storms of unnatural intensity, tempests that deviated from natural patterns in ways that suggested deliberate intelligence directing them. The storm power of the Zmey operated on multiple destructive levels simultaneously. Physical devastation came through wind that could level forests, through hail that could shatter crops and kill livestock, through torrential rain that could flood rivers beyond their banks and inundate settlements. But beyond the physical destruction lay psychological terror, the understanding that the heavens themselves had become weaponized, that the sky, which human civilization depended upon, had been transformed into an instrument of hostile intent. When a kingdom suffered multiple consecutive seasons of storm and blight, interpretations would inevitably emerge that the Zmey had turned the weather itself against them. Some accounts describe how entire regions would fall under such atmospheric siege, experiencing years of ruined harvests and environmental devastation directly attributable to dragon-conjured storms. Populations would be forced to abandon ancestral territories, cities would be depopulated, and the dragon would consolidate control through the complete environmental subjugation of the region. The combination of fire and storm created a synergistic, destructive capability that transcended what either power alone could achieve. A dragon that commanded both flames and weather could employ fire during periods of drought when lightning struck dry tinder, could intensify storms with additional heat and flame, could create environmental conditions of such severity that survival itself became questionable. The medieval Slavic peoples, already dwelling on territories characterized by extreme weather and environmental unpredictability, would have perceived a dragon commanding fire and storm as a being that had effectively enslaved the natural world itself. The forces that governed existence, seasons, weather, atmospheric conditions, would appear to have been brought under the dominion of a malevolent consciousness. To pray to the gods for favorable weather would seem futile when the dragon possessed apparent authority over those same meteorological forces. Some accounts suggest that the Zmey's control over storm and fire was not merely destructive, but could also be employed strategically and selectively. The dragon could protect its favored territories from flooding while inundating the lands of rebellious populations. It could intensify storms to obscure its movements or create weather conditions that immobilized armies attempting to approach its lair. Certain narratives describe the Zmey employing fire and storm as negotiating tools, demonstrating its power through localized weather events or controlled conflagrations, showing subordinate populations exactly what catastrophe awaited should tribute be withheld. In this framework, the dragon's elemental powers served not merely as weapons, but as instruments of psychological manipulation, tools through which the Zmey could demonstrate its capability and enforce compliance. The display of fire and storm became language through which the dragon communicated its absolute authority and the futility of resistance. What becomes apparent through examination of Zmey fire and storm powers is that these forces represented more than mere destructive capability. They embodied a fundamental alienation between the dragon and human civilization. Humans had developed agricultural societies through careful negotiation with natural forces, learning when to plant, how to manage water, how to survive seasonal variations. The Zmey's command of these forces represented a violation of this hard-won relationship, a weaponization of nature itself against those who depended upon its manageable cycles. The dragon transformed the environment from a neutral force requiring skillful navigation into an actively hostile landscape. Mountains became dangerous through intensified weather. Rivers became threats through redirected storms. Crops became uncertain through manipulated climate. In subjugating the elements, the Zmey effectively subjugated the very possibility of human survival within its claimed territories. The narratives we have thus far encountered present the Zmey primarily as a force of overwhelming malevolence, a being driven relentlessly toward domination and destruction. Yet to accept this singular interpretation would be to profoundly diminish our understanding of Slavic dragon mythology, and to fail to recognize a complexity embedded within these traditions that distinguishes them from simpler binary moral frameworks. Scattered throughout the folklore of Eastern Europe, preserved in tales that survive less prominently than the epic accounts of Dobrynya's battles, exist narratives of a different order, accounts of Zmey that acted not as destroyers but as guardians, not as malevolent sovereigns but as protectors of sacred knowledge and keepers of cosmic balance. These alternative manifestations challenge us to recognize that the Zmey represented not a simple principle of evil, but rather a more nuanced embodiment of primordial force, capable of both devastation and protection, depending on circumstances and the moral framework through which it operated. The moral universe of Slavic dragon mythology was not a simple dichotomy of good against evil, but rather a complex terrain where categories of right and wrong became blurred and ambiguous. Some accounts preserved in Serbian and Bulgarian folklore describe dragon figures that had established protective pacts with human communities, beings that would defend their chosen territories against invasion and external threat in exchange for recognition and appropriate tribute. These guardian dragons occupied roles analogous to feudal lords or territorial protectors, maintaining order within their domains and intervening militarily when outside forces threatened the populations under their protection. Such relationships existed in careful equilibrium. The dragon's protection came at genuine cost. Yet, communities within dragon-protected territories enjoyed security from external predation that non-protected regions might lack. These accounts suggest a worldview in which the Zmey could be negotiated with, in which appropriate recognition of dragon authority could secure advantages worth the price of submission. The dragon in these narratives functions not as an external catastrophe, but rather as a strange ally, a being whose interests aligned with community survival and who could be relied upon to fulfill protective obligations so long as tribute continued to be rendered. The concept of the Zmey as guardian of sacred places appears repeatedly across Slavic traditions, manifesting in accounts of dragons that maintained possession of treasures, knowledge, or locations of profound spiritual significance. These dragons did not necessarily hoard wealth in the manner of conventional dragon greed, but rather maintained stewardship over objects and places of sacred importance. Some narratives describe Zmey that prevented mortal access to dangerous magical knowledge, guarding against human misuse of powerful secrets through the simple mechanism of eliminating those who sought such knowledge prematurely or without proper spiritual preparation. Other accounts present dragons as keepers of ancient temples or sacred locations, beings whose presence both protected these places from desecration and prevented unworthy individuals from accessing the spiritual power concentrated there. In this framework, the dragon's destructive capability served defensive purposes, not aggression, but rather protection of the sacred against violation by the profane. The preservation of ancient wisdom represents another dimension of benevolent Zmey function that appears particularly in older folk traditions. Some legends describe how certain dragon figures accumulated knowledge across centuries of existence and, rather than hoarding this knowledge selfishly, would occasionally share it with worthy human seekers. These benevolent knowledge keepers appear in certain Russian and Ukrainian narratives as semi-divine beings, almost more like supernatural mentors than destructive monsters. A hero might journey to seek out such a dragon, facing trials and tests designed to evaluate worthiness, and emerge with knowledge that would enable remarkable achievements. The dragon in these contexts becomes a kind of exam proctor or spiritual guardian, testing and ultimately elevating the humans who seek them out. The relationship between human and dragon, though still characterized by power imbalance, transforms into something approaching mutual respect and recognition of shared commitment to cosmic order. What makes these benevolent manifestations particularly significant is that they suggest the Zmey mythology possessed sufficient conceptual flexibility to accommodate radically different moral interpretations without losing coherence. The three-headed dragon, commanding fire and storm, the being of overwhelming intelligence and magical power. This fundamental creature could be portrayed either as absolute destructive force or as protective sovereignty, depending on how the narrative framework positioned its relationship to human communities. Some scholars have theorized that the variation between malevolent and benevolent dragons reflected different historical experiences. Communities that had negotiated successful relationships with neighboring warlords or territorial lords might mythologize those relationships as dragon pacts, while communities that had experienced devastating invasions would preserve traumatic memories in the form of malevolent Zmey narratives. In this interpretation, the mythology itself became a repository of different historical experiences, with each telling preserving some aspect of complex relationships between human settlements and the powerful external forces that dominated and constrained their existence. The transformation of the Zmey into more benevolent forms also appears connected to processes of cultural synthesis and religious integration. As Christianization swept through Slavic territories, pagan dragons were incorporated into the new theological framework. Some were demonized into agents of Satan and absolute evil, but others were subtly reinterpreted, becoming creatures that, while potentially dangerous, operated according to comprehensible principles and could even serve divine purposes. A dragon that protected sacred Christian sites or tested the faith of believers could be accommodated within Christian cosmology without requiring absolute demonization. This selective accommodation of dragon figures suggests that medieval Christian authorities recognized that the dragon archetype possessed cultural resonance too profound to be completely eliminated, and therefore adapted it to new theological frameworks rather than suppressing it entirely. The ambiguous moral status of certain dragons also reflects a broader Slavic cosmological principle in which the universe was understood to contain multiple orders of being, each operating according to its own logic and morality. What appeared evil from a human perspective might represent necessary balance or cosmic order from another viewpoint. The Zmey that demanded tribute and took princesses was not merely evil, but rather was operating according to principles of hierarchical order and extraction that reflected established patterns of feudal relationships and warrior culture. From the dragon's perspective, it was not committing atrocities, but rather establishing and maintaining legitimate dominion. This perspective does not excuse the dragon's actions from a human moral viewpoint, but rather contextualizes them within a broader philosophical framework that acknowledged the existence of competing moral systems and the legitimate operation of force and hierarchy as organizing principles. Some of the most fascinating accounts describe dragons that embodied dual characteristics, beings that were simultaneously destructive and protective, dangerous and beneficial. Certain narratives present Zmey that would devastate the lands of kingdoms that failed to show proper respect or maintain appropriate tribute, yet would defend those same territories against external invasion with ferocity matching that which it applied to internal domination. These complex figures challenge simple moral categorization. They were neither heroes nor villains, but rather powerful entities operating according to logic, fundamentally alien to human ethics, yet comprehensible within their own framework. The acceptance of such moral complexity in dragon mythology reflects a degree of philosophical sophistication that suggests Slavic peoples possessed nuanced understanding of how power operated in their world, and how survival often required negotiation with forces that transcended simple moral judgment. The transformation of the Zmey from mythological terror to heraldic symbol represents a fascinating process through which cultures domesticate and institutionalize the forces they fear most profoundly. What began as a being of primordial malevolence, preserved in epic narratives and folk traditions as a threat to civilization itself, gradually became integrated into the formal systems through which Slavic kingdoms represented power, authority, and sovereignty. Across royal seals and fortification insignia, on banners carried into battle, and on the gates of ancient cities, the dragon image appeared with increasing regularity throughout medieval Eastern Europe. This integration of the Zmey into heraldic tradition was not merely decorative embellishment, but rather represented a profound cultural statement, an assertion that Slavic peoples had not merely survived dragon threats, but had claimed the dragon symbol itself as an expression of their own authority and power. The dragon on a heraldic shield represented a reversal of the power dynamic implicit in the mythological narratives, a transformation through which the hunted became the hunters, through which those who had suffered under dragon dominion claimed the dragon's image as their own. The heraldic representations of dragons across Slavic territories exhibited remarkable consistency in certain core elements, while simultaneously demonstrating regional variation, reflecting specific historical and cultural contexts. The most common heraldic dragon configuration consisted of 2 heads, rather than the 3, 6, or 9 that appeared in folklore narratives, suggesting that the symbolic requirements of heraldry differed from the cosmological significance preserved in mythology. 2-headed dragons appeared particularly on Serbian and Russian royal insignia, their dual heads oriented in opposite directions to suggest vigilance and dual authority. These heraldic dragons were typically depicted in profile with wings extended, claws visible, and an overall posture suggesting readiness and controlled power, rather than the chaotic destructiveness of their folkloric counterparts. The stylized nature of heraldic dragons reflected the practical requirements of representation on seals and banners. They needed to be recognizable at distance and reproducible in various materials and sizes, requirements that demanded simplification and standardization of form. The adoption of dragon symbolism by Slavic nobility reflected a sophisticated understanding of how symbols operated in medieval political systems. A dragon on a royal seal communicated multiple simultaneous messages to observers. It asserted that the ruler who claimed the dragon possessed power comparable to the mythological being itself, that the realm existed under sovereignty capable of containing or commanding such forces. The dragon symbol suggested that the kingdom was not defenseless against external threats, but rather possessed rulers of formidable capability and authority. To display the dragon was to claim lineage or connection to the ancient powers that Slavic peoples had encountered, and, through heroic effort, survived. The specific positioning of heraldic dragons, often depicted in poses of submission, with chains or other restraint symbols visible, suggested that Slavic kings had not merely encountered dragons, but had effectively subjugated them, transforming wild destructive power into symbols of royal authority. Serbian heraldic tradition demonstrates particularly rich utilization of dragon symbolism in the construction of dynastic and territorial identity. Various Serbian royal houses incorporated dragon imagery into their coats of arms, each iteration carrying subtle variations that reflected particular historical circumstances and political claims. Some Serbian dragons appeared crowned, suggesting that dragon power had been legitimized and integrated into the structure of Christian kingship. Others maintained more naturalistic forms, preserving visual connection to the legendary Zmey of folklore while nonetheless functioning as heraldic symbols. The Serbian adoption of dragon symbolism extended to architectural applications, with dragons carved into castle stonework and fortification gates, creating a material and visual environment in which dragon power was omnipresent as an expression of dynastic and territorial authority. Walking through the gates of a Serbian fortress decorated with dragon sculpture would have created an experience in which the mythological dragon and the heraldic symbol merged, in which legendary threat became architectural reality and assertion of power. Russian heraldic tradition similarly integrated dragon symbolism into systems of representation, though with distinctive characteristics reflecting Russian historical experience and cultural preferences. The double-headed eagle, rather than the dragon, ultimately became the most prominent Russian heraldic symbol, yet dragons retained significant presence in regional and local insignia across Russian territories. Certain Russian principalities emphasized dragon symbolism to claim historical continuity with pre-Mongol kingdoms and to assert resistance to foreign domination. The appearance of dragons on Russian seals and architectural elements represented cultural memory, a way of visually asserting that despite centuries of foreign domination and external pressure, Slavic peoples maintained connection to their ancient mythological heritage and the cultural strength it represented. The integration of dragons into fortification design represented a particularly significant manifestation of heraldic dragon symbolism, transforming mythological creatures from folkloric entities into permanent architectural features. Castles and city walls throughout Eastern Europe featured dragon sculptures and carvings, particularly at vulnerable points such as gates and corners. These decorative elements served practical, symbolic purposes. They identified the fortification's ownership and communicated to approaching travelers or potential invaders the identity and authority of the controlling power. But they also served psychological functions, creating an environment in which the dragon's legendary power became material and permanent. To approach a fortified gate decorated with dragon sculpture was to acknowledge entry into territory claimed by dragon-empowered authority. The dragon in stone became an extension of the ruler's presence, a permanent manifestation of power and sovereignty. The appearance of dragons in Slavic coinage and official seals extended heraldic dragon symbolism into systems of economic and administrative authority. A dragon on a coin represented not merely decoration, but rather a guarantee of legitimacy and value, an assertion that the currency bearing the dragon image came from a realm of sufficient power and authority to merit trust and acceptance. Seals bearing dragon imagery were used to authenticate official documents and contracts, transforming the mythological creature into a participant in the legal and administrative structures through which Slavic kingdoms maintained order. The dragon seal pressed into wax became a kind of magical protection for documents, a way of extending the dragon's power into the realm of official record and governance. What emerges through examination of heraldic dragon symbolism across Slavic territories is a sophisticated process through which cultures transformed elements of their mythology into instruments of political and territorial assertion. The dragon, which in narrative form represented forces that threatened civilization and required heroic confrontation to overcome, became in heraldic form a symbol of the authority and power that legitimized rule itself. This transformation was not a diminishment of the dragon's significance, but rather a translation of its meaning into new contexts. The heraldic dragon preserved the legendary creature's association with power, intelligence, and cosmic significance, while redirecting those qualities into service of dynastic and territorial sovereignty. Through this process, the Zmey became permanently embedded in the material culture and visual identity of Eastern European kingdoms, transforming from purely mythological entity into an omnipresent symbol of political authority. Beneath the surface of Zmey mythology lies a historical substratum that demands examination, a layer of collective memory encoded within narrative form, preserved through centuries of transmission in the epic poems and folk tales that communities use to process and comprehend their own traumatic past. To understand why the Zmey assumed such terrifying prominence in Slavic consciousness, why the dragon motif persisted with such remarkable consistency across centuries and territories, one must recognize that these were not abstract fantasies untethered from historical reality, but rather expressions of genuine threats that Slavic peoples confronted and endured. The invasions, migrations, and military incursions that swept across Eastern Europe from the steppes, waves of nomadic warriors who descended upon settled agricultural communities with overwhelming cavalry forces and destructive capability. These historical events found expression through the dragon mythology. The Zmey became, in a very real sense, a container for historical trauma and cultural memory, a mythological form through which communities could articulate and process experiences of invasion, subjugation, and the constant threat of annihilation from external forces. The historical context that gave rise to dragon symbolism as a metaphor for external threat cannot be overstated. Slavic peoples inhabited territories that occupied a cruel position in Eurasian geopolitics. They possessed fertile agricultural lands and developed settlements, but they lacked the geographical barriers that protected Western European societies from massive military incursions. The steppes to the east and south of Slavic territories served as highways for successive waves of aggressive expansionist populations. Scythians, Sarmatians, Huns, Avars, Khazars, and eventually Mongols and Tatars, each of these peoples posed existential threats to established Slavic communities. The historical memory of these invasions became encoded within the Zmey mythology, with the dragon serving as symbolic representation of the nomadic warrior threat that seemed to emerge periodically from the boundaries of the known world. The dragon descended from mountains, or emerged from the steppes, just as the historical invaders descended from their homelands, bringing devastation and subjugation to settled populations. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century represent a particularly significant context for understanding dragon mythology as encoded historical memory. The unprecedented scale of Mongol conquest, the military techniques that rendered conventional fortifications obsolete, the wholesale destruction of established civilizations. These realities would have generated psychological and cultural impacts that required processing and expression. The Zmey, with its overwhelming military capability, its apparent unkillability, its capacity to devastate entire regions, and its systematic subjugation of populations through terror, functioned as a perfect metaphorical vehicle for expressing the Mongol threat. The three-headed or nine-headed dragon commanding legions of subordinate forces paralleled the hierarchical organization of Mongol military structures. The dragon's collection of tribute mirrored the Mongol extraction of resources from conquered territories. The kidnapping of princesses echoed the Mongol practice of incorporating conquered populations into their empire through marriage alliances and assimilation. The mythology, in essence, became a vehicle through which historical trauma could be articulated and comprehended. The Tatar invasions and subsequent extended period of Tatar dominion over Russian territories, what became known as the Mongol yoke or Tatar yoke, intensified and sustained the association between dragon imagery and external nomadic threat. For centuries, Tatar raids and threats remained a constant feature of Russian political reality. Periodic incursions that devastated border regions and generated ongoing insecurity. The continuity of the threat across generations meant that the dragon mythology remained perpetually relevant, perpetually applicable to the actual conditions of Russian existence. The bylinas that preserved Dobrynya Nikitich's confrontations with the Zmey were not merely historical accounts, but rather repeated narratives through which each generation could engage with the fundamental challenge that defined their existence, the necessity of resistance against overwhelming external force. By preserving these tales, communities maintained cultural connection to heroic confrontation and survival against odds that seemed perpetually impossible to overcome. The Zmey's characteristic behaviors, the systematic extraction of tribute, the strategic deployment of terror, the integration of conquered populations into a hierarchical order, these features reflected actual historical patterns of nomadic conquest and tributary relationships. Successful resistance to nomadic invasions generally occurred not through direct military confrontation, but rather through negotiation, through the establishment of tributary relationships that acknowledge external authority while preserving internal autonomy. The bylinas, in preserving complex encounters between Dobrynya and the Zmey that sometimes culminated in negotiated settlement rather than simple victory, encoded this historical reality. The dragon could not always be defeated conclusively, but it could be restrained, forced into agreements, and limited in its capacity for devastation. These narratives represented not fantasy, but rather coded versions of actual survival strategies employed by Slavic communities confronting historical invaders. The geographical specificity of Zmey narratives further supports interpretation of the dragon as encoded response to historical invasion. Many bylinas situate the Zmey in mountain regions and border territories, precisely the geographical locations where nomadic invaders would most likely encounter and conflict with settled Slavic populations. The dragon's lair in the mountains becomes a representation of the foreign homeland from which invaders descended. The journey undertaken by Dobrynya toward the dragon's mountain dwelling parallels the defensive military expeditions undertaken by Russian princes against Tatar forces. The specific geographical details preserved in these narratives reflect actual territorial conflicts and military campaigns, now expressed through mythological language. The transformation of historical geography into mythological landscape did not diminish the historical content, but rather elevated it, lending to mundane military reality the cosmic significance necessary to process and preserve it across generations. The symbolic association of the Zmey with particular ethnic groups or populations also supports historical interpretation of dragon mythology. Some versions of bylinas describe the Zmey as a foreign being, explicitly associated with non-Slavic populations. The dragon speaks with an accent or in languages foreign to Slavic tongues. Its appearance and customs mark it as fundamentally alien to Slavic civilization. These details encode cultural memory of actual encounters with ethnically and linguistically distinct populations who pose threats to Slavic existence. The demonization or exoticization of the dragon in certain accounts reflects the psychological processing of encounters with culturally alien forces and threatening populations. By rendering the invader as dragon rather than acknowledging it as human, mythology permitted communities to express the traumatic alienness of encountering forces that seem to operate according to entirely different logic and value systems. The persistence of dragon symbolism across centuries of changing political circumstances suggests that the mythology remained flexible enough to accommodate different historical situations while maintaining continuity with core narrative structures. As specific threats changed, Mongol invasions gave way to Tatar raids. Tatar threats eventually diminished. The dragon mythology proved capable of incorporating new enemies and new historical circumstances. The flexibility of the Zmey archetype meant that it could serve as representation for whatever external threat most immediately endangered a community. In this sense, the Zmey was not merely historical metaphor, but rather a living mythological form that each generation adapted to its particular circumstances while maintaining connection to ancestral traditions of resistance and survival. The dragon became the eternal enemy, the perpetual threat against which Slavic peoples defined their identity and asserted their civilization's capacity to endure. The transition from oral tradition to written record represents a crucial moment in the preservation and transformation of mythology. When scribes began committing Zmey narratives to parchment, when chroniclers attempted to integrate dragon accounts into the formal historical record, the mythology underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The written word carried different cultural authority than oral transmission. It suggested historical verification and documentary legitimacy that oral tales, however ancient and repeated, could not claim. Yet this shift toward written documentation also created new tensions and complications, as medieval scribes grappled with the fundamental question of how to represent supernatural beings and extraordinary events within the constraints of chronicle traditions that aspired toward factual accuracy. The resulting texts reveal the complex negotiation between the demands of historical documentation and the cultural necessity of preserving dragon mythology as meaningful record. The Russian primary chronicle, compiled in the 11th and 12th centuries and representing one of the foundational texts of Russian historical writing, includes scattered references to supernatural threats and creatures that scholars have long recognized as manifestations of dragon mythology encoded within historical narrative. These references are typically sparse and presented with deliberate restraint, as though the chroniclers recognize the tension between their role as historians and their responsibility to record events that their communities understood as having genuine historical significance. The presentation of supernatural threats alongside accounts of military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations created a historical record in which the boundary between natural and supernatural remained porous and uncertain. When a chronicle described a region being devastated by forces that combined natural disaster with malevolent intent, readers would have understood these accounts as descriptions of dragon activity, even if the specific term, Zmey, did not appear in the text. Illuminated manuscripts preserved throughout Eastern European monastic institutions and royal libraries provide another crucial documentary source for understanding how medieval elites conceptualized and preserved dragon imagery. These manuscripts frequently feature dragon illustrations, in margins, and decorative elements, images that reveal how medieval artists visualized the creatures that had threatened their ancestors and continue to populate their spiritual and mythological landscape. The artistic choices embedded in these illustrations, the specific proportions of dragon bodies, the number and positioning of heads, the details of scales and claws, provide material evidence of how dragon imagery was understood and transmitted through visual culture. Monastic scribes who decorated manuscripts with dragons were not merely producing decorative embellishment, but rather participating in the preservation and canonicalization of dragon imagery, ensuring that future generations would encounter standardized visual representations of these creatures. Serbian medieval texts, particularly those preserved in monastic chronicles and royal records, contain surprisingly rich documentation of dragon-related events and beliefs. The Serbian despots' courts maintained recording practices that documented historical events with enough specificity to occasionally reference dragon sightings or supernatural threats interpreted as dragon activity. These accounts were typically presented with careful qualification. Phrases suggesting uncertainty or alternative explanations were frequently included, yet the basic narrative content remained clear. A devastating plague or military disaster might be recorded with both naturalistic explanations and suggestions of supernatural causation, permitting readers to interpret events according to their own cosmological framework. The preservation of these ambiguous accounts within official historical records suggests that Serbian authorities recognized dragon mythology as possessing sufficient cultural legitimacy to merit inclusion in formal documentation, even as they hedged against full commitment to supernatural explanations. Bulgarian chronicle traditions similarly incorporated dragon references into historical narrative, though the specific manifestations and frequency of dragon documentation varied across different regional chronicling traditions. Some Bulgarian monastic chronicles contain extended passages describing encounters with dragon forces, presented with sufficient circumstantial detail to suggest that chroniclers were drawing upon oral traditions or earlier written accounts that had preserved specific incidents interpreted as dragon activity. The positioning of these accounts within broader narrative structures of Bulgarian history suggests that dragon encounters were understood as significant historical events, worthy of documentary preservation, not merely as entertaining folklore to be segregated from serious historical record. The integration of dragon material into formal chronicle tradition thus served to legitimize the mythology by associating it with official historical documentation. Ukrainian medieval texts, despite the limited survival of early Ukrainian written sources due to historical circumstances, including invasion and cultural suppression, preserve intriguing references to dragon-related events and beliefs. The few surviving chronicles and religious texts that contain Ukrainian cultural elements demonstrate that dragon mythology maintained significant presence in Ukrainian historical consciousness, even as formal documentary traditions remained less developed than in neighboring regions. The relative scarcity of Ukrainian medieval texts makes interpretation more challenging, yet the references that do survive suggest continuity with broader Slavic dragon traditions, while reflecting specific adaptations reflecting Ukrainian historical experience and territorial concerns. The process through which scribes transformed oral epic narratives into written chronicle form reveals crucial dimensions of how dragon mythology was understood by medieval elites. When the exploits of Dobrynya Nikitich and his confrontations with the Zmey were committed to parchment, scribes faced choices about how to present material that blended legendary heroism with mythological elements. Some versions emphasize the historical plausibility of the accounts, presenting dragon encounters as extraordinary but not fundamentally impossible events that a sufficiently capable hero might experience. Other versions embrace the explicitly supernatural dimensions, depicting the confrontation between hero and dragon as an engagement between fundamentally different orders of being that transcended natural possibility. These varying approaches to documentary presentation suggest that medieval scribes possess differing theoretical frameworks for understanding how mythology related to historical reality. The marginal annotations and textual variants preserved in surviving manuscripts provide evidence of ongoing scholarly debate about dragon accounts within educated medieval circles. Monastic communities that preserved and copied dragon-related texts frequently included commentary expressing doubt, proposing alternative interpretations, or offering theological frameworks for understanding how dragon mythology fit within Christian cosmology. These annotations reveal that dragon material was not accepted uncritically, but rather subjected to ongoing interpretation and theological negotiation. The persistence of dragon references across multiple copying generations and throughout revised chronicle editions suggests that despite skepticism among some educated observers, the mythology retains sufficient cultural importance to merit continued preservation and transmission. The very act of repeatedly copying texts containing dragon material represented an implicit statement that these narratives possessed cultural and spiritual significance worthy of preservation. The Zmey did not fade into obscurity when parchment replaced oral memory as the primary vehicle of cultural preservation. Instead, the dragon mythology underwent a transformation as profound and complex as the cultures that continue to transmit it. The confrontation between Christianity and pagan belief systems that swept across Eastern Europe created conditions in which the Zmey could have disappeared entirely, absorbed into demonological frameworks that rendered it merely another manifestation of demonic opposition to Christian civilization. Yet the dragon endured, adapted, and persisted, finding new forms of expression and new cultural contexts in which to operate. This survival across the boundary between pagan and Christian worldviews, across centuries of political transformation and cultural upheaval, attests to something fundamental about the Zmey mythology, an enduring resonance that transcended specific historical moments and spoke to perpetually relevant human concerns about power, danger, and the forces that threaten civilization. The earliest phase of this transformation occurred during the period of Christianization itself, when missionary activity and ecclesiastical authority swept through Slavic territories with determination to eradicate pagan belief systems and establish Christian orthodoxy. The process was neither swift nor complete. Pagan beliefs and practices persisted in rural regions and among populations distant from centers of ecclesiastical authority, creating a syncretic religious landscape in which Christian theology and pagan cosmology coexisted and interpenetrated. The Zmey, rather than being entirely suppressed, was incorporated into the new religious framework. In some instances, the dragon became explicitly demonized, transformed into a servant of Satan, or a manifestation of demonic forces arrayed against Christian civilization. Religious texts and ecclesiastical writings describe encounters with dragon demonic entities, preserving dragon mythology within new theological contexts. The dragon remained dangerous, remained powerful, remained a focal point for cultural anxiety. But now that danger was articulated through Christian cosmological language and theological frameworks. Yet even within Christianized contexts, the Zmey retained much of its original complexity and resisted complete demonization. Some Christian-influenced accounts describe dragons that tested the faith of believers, or operated according to comprehensible principles that permitted negotiation and coexistence with human communities. The dragon became, in certain traditions, a creature that might be converted or reformed, that could acknowledge divine authority and submit to Christian moral frameworks. So this flexibility in how Christianity incorporated dragon mythology suggests that ecclesiastical authorities recognized the cultural significance of the Zmey as being sufficiently profound to warrant accommodation rather than suppression. The dragon, transformed though it was by Christian theology, remained a viable and meaningful expression of cosmic principles that Slavic peoples needed to conceptualize and comprehend. The period following the initial waves of Christianization witnessed the consolidation of dragon mythology into formal literary and folkloric traditions that would preserve it for subsequent centuries. The bylinas that had existed in oral form were gradually recorded in written versions, ensuring that the exploits of Dobrynya Nikitich and other dragon-confronting heroes would survive beyond the lifetime of individual storytellers. These written compilations, though recording oral traditions, necessarily transform them through the processes of transcription and codification. The flexibility and variability characteristic of oral transmission gave way to more standardized versions, though significant regional and textual variations persisted. The recording of dragon mythology in written form represented a crucial preservation mechanism, creating documentary evidence that would permit future generations to encounter the narratives that had sustained their ancestors. The emergence of dragon symbolism in medieval heraldry and political representation created another dimension through which the Zmey mythology survived and transformed. As previously discussed, the dragon image became integrated into systems of royal authority and territorial representation, transforming from purely mythological being into symbol of political power. This integration into official systems of representation ensured that dragon imagery remained visible and culturally prominent, even as active belief in dragons as literal historical creatures gradually diminished among educated elites. A peasant in medieval Eastern Europe might encounter the dragon primarily through folklore and oral tradition, while a courtier or nobleman would encounter it through heraldic symbols adorning royal seals and fortifications. The multiplication of dragon imagery across different cultural contexts and different social registers ensured that no single population segment could escape or forget the dragon mythology. The early modern period witnessed the beginning of a gradual shift in how educated European societies conceptualized the Zmey and dragon mythology more broadly. As Renaissance thought brought new frameworks for understanding natural philosophy and the boundaries between possible and impossible phenomena, dragons began to transition from entities understood as literally existing beings toward creatures understood as primarily mythological or allegorical. Yet this transition was neither swift nor complete. Travelers' accounts from Eastern Europe continued to include dragon sightings and reports well into the modern era. and rural populations maintained belief in the literal existence of dragons despite official skepticism from educated elites. The fragmentation of dragon belief into competing frameworks, literal belief in rural regions, skepticism among educated elites, survival in literary and heraldic contexts, created a complex cultural landscape in which the Zmey could be simultaneously understood as real or fictional depending on one's position within social and educational hierarchies. The Romantic era brought renewed interest in folklore and mythology across European intellectual culture, creating conditions favorable to the preservation and resurgence of dragon mythology. Collectors of folklore recorded Zmey narratives from oral sources, ensuring their preservation in published collections that gave them permanence and authority. Romantic poets and writers drew upon dragon imagery for literary purposes, incorporating the Zmey into new creative works that reinterpreted ancient mythology through contemporary sensibilities. This romantic rehabilitation of dragon mythology elevated the Zmey from the status of folk superstition to that of significant cultural artifact worthy of scholarly and artistic attention. The dragon became simultaneously a symbol of vanishing pagan traditions, deserving preservation, and a vehicle through which modern writers could explore themes of power, danger, and the conflict between civilization and wild nature. The 20th and 21st centuries witnessed a proliferation of dragon representations across contemporary popular culture, fantasy literature, cinema, and digital media. The Zmey, while no longer understood as a literally existing threat by modern audiences, nevertheless persists as a compelling fictional entity capable of bearing contemporary meanings and concerns. Modern fantasy authors have drawn extensively upon Slavic dragon mythology, incorporating elements of Zmey Gorynych and related traditions into elaborate fictional worlds. The dragon appears in contemporary literature, sometimes as villain, sometimes as misunderstood, being deserving of sympathy, sometimes as manifestation of environmental or social forces threatening civilization. This multiplication of dragon representations across contemporary media demonstrates the continued vitality and adaptability of the Zmey archetype. The fundamental structure and symbolism of the dragon myth proves flexible enough to accommodate contemporary preoccupations while maintaining recognizable connection to ancestral traditions. What emerges through this historical survey is recognition that the Zmey mythology has not declined into historical irrelevance, but rather has undergone continuous transformation and adaptation across centuries of cultural change. The core elements, the multiple heads, the intelligence and magical capability, the capacity for destruction and domination, have persisted while finding new contexts and new meanings in each historical era. The mythology remains alive in the sense that each generation continues to engage with it, to interpret it, and to find within it resonance with contemporary concerns. The Zmey of medieval folklore, the Zmey of heraldic symbolism, the Zmey of romantic literature, and the Zmey of contemporary fantasy all represent continuations and transformations of the same fundamental mythological entity, each iteration preserving essential elements while adapting others to reflect the preoccupations and worldviews of its particular historical moment. We have journeyed across centuries and territories, through oral traditions and written chronicles, through the transformation of mythology into heraldic symbolism and its resurrection in contemporary imagination. We have encountered the Zmey in its many manifestations, as terror and protector, as external threat and internal principle, as historical memory and timeless archetype. We have traced how a people facing overwhelming external pressures, dwelling in territories where danger seemed perpetually imminent, created and preserved a mythology capable of expressing their deepest fears and highest aspirations for heroic resistance. Now, as we stand at the conclusion of this exploration, we must confront a question that transcends mere historical curiosity. What does the Zmey mean? Why does this ancient dragon, seemingly vanquished by time and modernity, continue to resonate in contemporary consciousness? What does the persistence of dragon mythology reveal about human nature and our relationship with forces that transcend our control? The Zmey, at its most fundamental level, represents an acknowledgement of limits. In a world that increasingly celebrates human dominion over nature and mastery of environment, the dragon mythology preserves an older wisdom, the recognition that forces exist beyond human capacity to fully comprehend or control. The Zmey cannot be reasoned with in the manner of human adversaries, cannot be defeated through technology or bureaucratic efficiency, cannot be eliminated through education or cultural progress. The dragon embodies the principle of otherness, of that which remains fundamentally alien, despite all our efforts at understanding and domestication. In preserving the Zmey, Slavic peoples maintained cultural connection to truths about existence that modern consciousness often obscures, that the world contains forces genuinely threatening to human civilization, that survival sometimes requires confrontation with the incomprehensible, and that courage matters even when success seems impossible. The mythology taught that sometimes the right response to overwhelming danger is not retreat, but rather the determination to struggle, knowing that struggle itself possesses value regardless of outcome. The intelligence of the Zmey, its capacity for language, reasoning, and magical knowledge, reveals something equally profound about how ancient peoples understood power and authority. The dragon was not depicted as a mindless force of nature, but rather as a conscious being operating according to its own logic and pursuing its own interests. This recognition of the adversary's rationality created space for the possibility of negotiation, of coexistence, of understanding that victory did not necessarily require complete annihilation of the opposing force. The Zmey mythology thus encoded sophisticated political wisdom, teaching that survival often required negotiation with powerful entities, accommodation of forces one could not entirely overcome, and the strategic acceptance of unfavorable but tolerable conditions. This wisdom remains relevant in contemporary contexts, where individuals and communities confront powerful institutional and environmental forces that cannot be simply defeated but must be navigated strategically and survived intelligently. The multiplicity of the Zmey, the multiple heads representing different dimensions of a single being, offers contemporary metaphorical possibilities for understanding problems and threats characterized by complexity and simultaneity. Modern existence confronts individuals and societies with challenges that operate on multiple registers simultaneously: environmental, economic, political, social, psychological. The three-headed or nine-headed dragon provides a mythological model for comprehending how multiple dimensions of a single force can operate in coordination toward destructive ends. The Zmey's multiplicity also suggests that complexity itself can be embodied, that forces need not be simple to be comprehensible. The mythology thus provides resources for thinking through intricate problems without reducing them to false simplicity. The heroic response to the Zmey, represented most famously in Dobrynya Nikitich's confrontations with Zmey Gorynych, preserves a particular vision of human agency and dignity. Dobrynya does not triumph through luck or through the passive reception of divine intervention, though both elements appear in various accounts. Rather, he succeeds through the combination of courage, intelligence, magical knowledge, and relentless determination. He understands that direct confrontation may be insufficient, that cunning and strategy matter as much as strength, that victory requires the integration of multiple capabilities and forms of knowledge. This portrait of heroic agency remains profoundly relevant to contemporary audiences. offering an alternative to both the nihilistic despair that suggests human action is futile and the simplistic triumphalism that suggests success merely requires sufficient determination or resources. Dobrynya teaches that meaningful action in the face of overwhelming challenge requires courage, married to intelligence, preparation combined with adaptability, and the acceptance that even a hero confronting a Zmey faces genuine risk of failure. The transformation of the Zmey from mythological terror into heraldic symbol demonstrates how cultures can reclaim and reappropriate the forces that threaten them. By displaying the dragon on shields and royal seals, by incorporating it into the material culture of power and authority, Slavic peoples asserted that they had not merely survived dragon threats, but had claimed the dragon's power as their own. This process of cultural appropriation and reclamation offers contemporary resonance. The suggestion that communities need not remain passive victims of external forces, but can consciously engage with the sources of their fear and suffering, transforming threat into symbol of resilience. The heraldic dragon becomes a statement. We have survived, we have endured, and we now display as our own symbol the very force that once threatened to annihilate us. The persistence of dragon mythology across centuries and into contemporary imagination reveals something fundamental about human storytelling and cultural memory. We do not preserve stories merely to document historical facts or to provide entertainment. We preserve stories because they encode wisdom about existence, because they permit us to explore possibilities and dangers within the safe container of narrative, because they provide frameworks through which subsequent generations can understand and navigate their own circumstances. The Zmey persists because the mythology addresses perennial human concerns, the reality of danger, the possibility of heroic resistance, the necessity of wisdom combined with courage, the recognition that some forces exceed human comprehension yet demand engagement nonetheless. Every retelling of a Zmey narrative by a contemporary author, every appearance of dragons in modern fantasy, every reference to ancient Slavic mythology represents an implicit assertion that the old stories remain relevant, that the wisdom they contain has not been rendered obsolete by modernity. As we conclude this exploration of the Zmey and Slavic dragon mythology, I invite you to recognize that you have been engaging not with dead history, but with a living tradition. The stories we have examined together continue to generate meaning, continue to speak to human concerns and aspirations, continue to offer resources for understanding the world and our place within it. The Zmey awaits in contemporary imagination, in fantasy literature, in scholarly study, in the continued cultural memory of Slavic peoples, and in the universal human capacity to create mythology in response to fundamental threats and challenges. I encourage you to explore these traditions further, to seek out the original bylinas and folk accounts, to discover how different cultures and different historical periods have interpreted and reinterpreted dragon mythology. And if you have found value in this journey through ancient Slavic tradition, I invite you to join the community at Echoes of the Old World, where we continue to preserve and illuminate the mythologies that shaped civilizations and continue to shape human imagination. Subscribe to our channel, share these explorations with others who might appreciate this deep engagement with cultural traditions that deserve preservation and celebration. The dragon waits in the mountains. The heroes stand ready. The stories endure. Thank you for walking this path with us.